Hi, sorry, I'm not Steve, but I think you are handing it to me first to introduce Steve. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Yep, can hear you, yeah.
Thank you, David. Thanks for that introduction. So yeah, I'm John Wilson, ISMLA committee member based here in the UK. I'm head of languages at Cheadle Hulme School, just to the south of Manchester. It's with great pleasure to introduce Steve Smith, who will be a familiar name to a lot of you. My first encounter with Steve was when I saw him speak at the Research Ed conference in Oxford, which was a sort of an interesting day where we were looking at English and modern languages connecting. My memory is not great, and thankfully that's the topic of the talk. But I think it was in 2017. It was definitely pre-pandemic. I can confirm that. That talk was entitled "It's Not What You Do, It's the Way That You Do It." Okay, today Steve is going to talk about memory. Also, just the text, the generosity with resources has been, as a language, has been really welcome. Thank you so much for Steve over the years, all that you provided for us with as language teachers in resources and also in research. A book that our department used quite a lot in our discussions, especially in recent years, is this one, Breaking the Sound Barrier, which he co-authored with Gianfranco Conti, and that's been a real focus on looking at perhaps what some classes a neglected skill in listening. Our trainee teachers really love the Becoming an Outstanding Language Teacher, the book that Steve has also published in recent years. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to Steve for his talk on memory. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Although I'm seeing a message saying host disabled participant screen sharing. So I think I need some sort of host status here. Not sure if someone can help with that.
Peter, that'll be over to you, please.
Yes. Yes, I've just made you a host, Steve.
Okay, let's just try that then. That seems to work now. Okay, thank you. Okay, right. We should be good to go. I hope you can all see that screen. And well, thank you for the welcome, John. I'm very honoured to be invited to talk with people from ISMLA. I think the last time was at Regent School in London, apparently. And yeah, I remember that session, Research Ed in Oxford. That was good fun to be there. It's about time they did another one for languages, I think, actually. So yeah, well, I hope to find something interesting to say to you this morning. And very often when I do talks like this, I try and combine a little bit of theory with practice. And in this case, I'm going to focus particularly on the subject of memory, and I'm going to pick out a few aspects from our book called Memory, What Every Language Teacher Should Know, which came out at the beginning of 2021. And I can't get through an awful lot in an hour, but I hope what I've found here will be useful for you and in some cases new, and will get you to think. So let's see if that works. So here's the plan. 6 points I want to cover in this hour. Firstly, something really fundamental for us language teachers, which is this question of what's called these days explicit versus implicit learning, and how that's important for building knowledge and memory. Secondly, I want to just run through the basics of memory models. Now, that might not be new for some of you, but for others it may still be. And because this is very much all the rage, particularly in the English system at the moment, I think it's worth just making sure that you're acquainted with some quite simple concepts to do with memory, working memory and long-term memory. Thirdly, I want to look at the issue of rehearsal, what cognitive scientists sometimes call maintenance rehearsal, practicing stuff in our heads and out loud to help build long-term memory, and I'll suggest some activities that can do that. I want to then talk about something particularly important for us as language teachers, which is the question of phonological memory. And there are some interesting implications of that for us, I think, and some of which relate to the new GCSE, which is due to come out in 2026. Then the issue of chunking, why chunking is important for language teachers, and how we can exploit, if you like, how we can leverage, as Americans might say, our working memory. And lastly, something that tends to be a bit less well known, the TAP effect. TAP stands for Transfer Appropriate Processing. And you'll see when I get there why that's important. So I hope these things will be of interest to you. Let's get cracking. Now, the first slide here, in a way, it's the most important of all, I think, for us language teachers. And actually, when I was in my 20s, I did an MA at the Institute of Education in London. And the topic of my dissertation then was what unconscious and conscious language learning. And at that time, it was all the rage to talk about Stephen Krashen's work. And he used to talk about, and still does actually, learning versus acquisition. These days in research papers, we tend to see the words explicit learning, Krashen's learning, and implicit learning, which is the unconscious route, or what Krashen would have called acquisition. So let's just remind ourselves of what's involved here, because although this might seem a little bit airy-fairy, actually it underpins everything we do in the classroom, and it's something that I've been grappling with for 40 or 50 years when it comes to language teaching, and maybe this has been an issue for you as well when you think about your practice. So on the one hand, on the left there, that slide, this explicit learning route, this is where we're consciously thinking about the language in our working memories. It tends to develop what's called declarative knowledge. Declarative knowledge is really knowing about the language. It's knowing that adjectives agree, for example, or that verbs have endings, or that you form the perfect tense by these rules. So that's knowledge about the language. And it tends to fit well with these currently popular models of memory, which usually involve boxes and arrows. You might have seen things like this, and I'll show you one or two in a moment. It's a model that works particularly well for subject knowledge. So, for example, if you're talking about science and learning concepts, learning facts, the explicit learning route fits well with that. And it probably helps develop what's far more important for us as language teachers: procedural knowledge, implicit knowledge about the language. In other words, being able to use the language without having to stop and think about it and analyze it. So if you speak, as you do, more than one language, you'll know that if you have some fluency in that other language, you just get on with speaking and you don't have to stop and think too much about accuracy. You might occasionally monitor it, which is another issue. But generally speaking, that's what we call procedural knowledge. You just know how to do it. And of course, that's what we would like our pupils to develop, at least to some extent. And by the way, we know that some of our very best pupils, and I certainly found this in my teaching, when you taught pupils for 7 years and they got to the upper 6th, year 13, and they were sitting there talking about all sorts of issues in French, you'd ask yourself, how did they get to this position? How is it that they're able to show this level of sophistication with the language? And was it to do with teaching rules and learning vocab, or was it just that contact with the language over 7 years, and maybe that exchange they did? And my conclusion was that it was really largely that. And in fact, the researchers tend to support that as well. So if you read any standard books on second language learning, they will tell you that the prime route for language acquisition, whether it be in the classroom or whether it be, for example, in an immersion context, is the implicit route, this unconscious sort of route that we gradually pick up language over the years. So on the right-hand side, then, that's what we're talking about here, the implicit route, the unconscious route, which develops procedural knowledge. So notice the contrast between declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge and the importance of that. Implicit knowledge then is often knowledge that can't be explained. For example, I wouldn't be very good at explaining the grammatical rules of English, even though I can speak English very well. It's what we normally think of as picking up the language in sort of lay terms. It actually bypasses working memory. In other words, we seem to develop this fluency without having to stop and think about rules and analyze the language. It just happens, doesn't it? And as I said, then it's the most powerful route. Now, Krashen back in the day was coined this term comprehensible input, which always sounds a bit of a jargon term, doesn't it? Comprehensible input. But all he's saying is that we acquire language simply by listening to and by reading language that we understand. And that's why over the years there's always been this big push for teachers to use the target language. And I don't think that's changed. I think that will remain a constant in language teaching, so that if we want to build long-term memory of both vocabulary and build up that sort of grammatical skill, it is essentially through using comprehensible input that we will get there. The big question is always, is it enough? And as we'll see, the balance of research, and I think our own teacher experience confirms this, is that really on its own, it isn't enough. We need to add some, if you like, instruction. So that's my starting point, and something that we need to bear in mind when we talk about memory. How do we build memory, and the importance of basically using the language? That's what builds memory mainly. So if on the one hand we've got this explicit route and we've got the implicit route, a massive question in research over the years is, can that explicit knowledge become implicit knowledge? In other words, is it useful to learn rules, to learn vocab from lists or apps? And by doing that sort of conscious learning, can that become procedural knowledge? And I think most teachers would assume that it can. I think we were all brought up to believe that, and it may even reflect our own experience, that it is worth teaching the rules of grammar, it's worth doing drills and so on, and that will help the language become procedural, if you like, implicit. The research actually is rather mixed on this, but the term that they use here is the interface. So the interface, if you like, is that sort of barrier between explicit learning and implicit learning. Can one become the other? That's the interface. And so researchers tend to have three views. Some think that there's actually no interface, that what we learn as explicit knowledge can't become implicit knowledge, and therefore we may not be wasting our time, but if we spend too much time teaching rules, then we could be sacrificing the more important work that needs to go on. So Krashen would have taken that view, and other writers have as well. And interestingly, when you look at brain research, when we process explicit knowledge, when we think about the rules, it does happen in a different part of the brain to the sort of way that we acquire language naturally. The psychologist Nick Ellis has done a lot of work on this, and they are two actually different routes. So that might suggest, well, they are different. One can't become the other. But on the other hand, you have those researchers who say, well, actually, in some circumstances, the declarative explicit can become the implicit. And that's called the strong interface position. I'd say that's held by a minority of researchers from my own reading. And I think the majority would go into that camp of the weak interface, that for some learners in some circumstances, knowing the rules and doing that formal learning can enable that to become procedural. And even someone who's quite a strong supporter of the interface would say that really for that to work, it tends to have to be adult learners, by which I mean beyond child age, into teen years, that would count. And it would also be probably more able, higher aptitude learners who are able to do this. And so many of the pupils that you teach in your context, it might well be the case that they could benefit from more formal grammatical work than students in some other contexts. I know I'm generalizing there when I say that, but this is why some argue that when we do too much formal grammatical work, it's not very inclusive, because it tends to favor, if you like, those higher aptitude and often more advantaged pupils. But I think the main takeaway for you as a teacher, if you think about this, is that there's little doubting that it's using the language which is far more important than describing it. And because as teachers, we're rather interested in grammar and the formal nature of language, that we risk spending too much time talking about it. And of course, we only have a limited amount of time in the classroom. So bottom line, procedural memory is best built by comprehensive input and interacting with it using the language. So after that little bit of food for thought, and I'm sure you've thought about those issues already for yourself and have your own opinion on them, let's have a look at one or two basic models of memory. Now, at the very simplest, at the moment, the predominant model of memory is really a sort of an information processing model. It kind of views the brain as a computer. And there are cognitive psychologists who think this is really quite wrong, and that we're stuck in this model of seeing the brain in a rather simple way as a computer, and that is far more complex. But I'm going to share this with you because it is well supported in theory by prominent cognitive psychologists, and I think it's a useful teacher model. So on the one hand, we've got the process of encoding. We get information, we somehow store it, and then we can retrieve it. So we look at vocab, for example, we memorize it, we store it, and then we retrieve it. Interestingly, this idea of storage is very misleading. It's not as if the brain is some sort of giant warehouse and that we have words and rules that we can pick out. It's an absurd notion, actually. What's really happening is that in terms of neurology, neurolinguistics, we are reactivating the same circuits in the brain. So when we recall a word that we previously learned and we bring it back, we retrieve it, we're actually just reactivating a circuit. It's not as if something is stored in any way at all, but storage is a handy sort of metaphor to use. And just delving a little bit more into the detail then, in this slide, you can see we've got the material from the environment, in other words, language that we see or hear, goes into our conscious working memory, our short-term memory, where we have things in mind, we're thinking about them. So when you ask a question and the child is working out their answer in class with their hand up, that's happening in working memory. And then the idea is that if we keep practicing things in working memory, they can find their way into long-term memory. But during that process, of course, things get lost. We forget things immediately from working memory. And also it seems that we lose items from long-term memory as well. They sort of fade away or decay, as the psychologists call it. And we have this sort of dynamic relationship between the long-term memory and working memory. And this is where there is a risk of simplification, I think, because if you imagine that long-term memory is one box and working memory is another, and they're two entirely distinct things, I can't imagine that is really the case. But it's a handy model to view in that case. So that's a general model of memory. And then in a little bit more detail, and this is where it gets the most technical, I would say. This is the Alan Baddeley model, probably the best known model of working memory and long-term memory. And there's a little bit of jargon in here, but it really expresses quite simple things. And in that particular diagram at the top, the central executive, as Baddeley calls it, this is really where we choose to focus our attention. So we decide what we're going to listen to. So if you're at a party and there are lots of different voices going on, you decide what you're going to focus on, and that's what you concentrate on. And it's the central executive, the frontal lobe of the brain, put crudely, that's where we decide what we're going to focus on. Now, when that information comes in, it comes in through two routes. On the left-hand side, it comes through what Baddeley calls the visuospatial sketchpad. In other words, what we see and also our sense of space, which is very powerful. We hold an image in our mind. On the right-hand side, with the big arrow there, is the phonological loop, phonological memory. Now, for us as language teachers, this is the big key. This is where we get sounds coming in, and then the brain processes those sounds, whether they be individual phonemes, syllables, words, morphemes, chunks, or whole sentences, and so on. Now, actually, in neurological terms, these things happen again in different parts of the brain. In fact, for most people, particularly right-handed people, if you your phonological processing tends to be in the part of the brain I'm touching here. If you can see me, it's for me, it's the left side of my head, and it's just above and behind the ear. In that part of the brain beneath the bone is where we process. We know this, we've known this since the 19th century, when physicians were able to analyze brains of people who had disabilities, suffered from aphasia, had strokes and so on. But now we're able to see it by real-time scanning. So that's key. Whereas the visual element tends to be more on the right brain or generally across the brain. Now, because they're quite separate, Baddeley then said, well, actually, we need some means of combining the two. And so he proposed this term episodic buffer. In other words, when we learn something, we base our learning on what we hear and also on what we see. And by combining those two things, it reinforces learning and memory. And that's why you may have heard this term dual coding, which is where we combine a picture with a sound or a word. It helps us remember. And I think as language teachers using flashcards over the years, we've always assumed that this is the case. Plus the fact that images help hold attention, don't they? So all this stuff then goes into long-term memory, which for us is language. I mentioned dual coding here. I've taken an image here from Oliver Caviglioli, which some of you might have heard of, who's done a lot of work with people like Tom Sherrington about cognitive science. And his image, if you like, gives you a different way of looking at this. So you can see that picture of the brain. We've got visual stimuli on the left, and then we've got auditory stimuli. So he calls it the auditory loop, the phonological loop. And then that goes into long-term memory. So here's an example of dual coding in practice, where we've got a diagram and some text, and hopefully that sort of makes the idea of this memory model clearer. So here's Alan Pavio's view of dual coding then. We have separate sound and image processing. Each channel can reinforce the other. And it's an argument for us as language teachers for using images with sound and written language. It's also, interestingly, an argument for what you might call scripted listening. That's listening whilst reading text. And certainly myself and Gianfranco Conti have been pushing this element quite a lot in the last few years. The idea that somehow when pupils do listening, we shouldn't feel that showing them the text is somehow cheating. It's rather scaffolding the task, and particularly with younger learners, and I would say particularly with weaker learners as well, showing the script is a great aid to building listening comprehension, but also reading comprehension. So consider that in your teaching. Are there times when you could use the text more often, and not just gap fill, but all sorts of other activities involving the text? It's also an argument for reading aloud, which used to be frowned upon, but I don't think should be. And of course, you may well know that in 2026 in the English GCSE, there will be a small element of reading aloud in the new exam. It will be a very small element, I understand, something like 35 to 50 words of reading aloud. Not much, is it? One issue when you show images or text is that there is that risk of what's called diverted attention. In other words, you might then look at the text and not listen, or you might look at the picture and not look at the words. So it's the delivery here that counts, the sort of activity that you do that means that pupils are paying attention to both the visual and the aural. Now, if you look at the limits of our working memory, so our working memory, there's short-term memory where we hold things consciously in mind, and I like to use this analogy because it happens to me very often. What if it happens to you? When you're making a recipe, just admitting someone into the room actually, when you're making a recipe, you look at the instructions, don't you? So I have my iPad out in the kitchen and I look at the first 2 or 3 instructions, and I go across to the other part of the kitchen. I start to chop my onions or crush my garlic, whatever I'm going to do, and then I realize I've forgotten what the next step is. So I go back to the recipe, I have another look, and I look again, go back over, and then realize I've forgotten again and I have to keep going back, which shows how fragile our working memory is. We can't hold things very easily in our memories. We know this when we have to learn phone numbers, but when we remember someone's name at a party, or from a pupil's point of view, think of them. They hear a sentence, we expect them to be able to hold it in memory and give some sort of response. And actually, for many pupils, it can disappear straight away and they're flummoxed and they don't know what to say. So how can we stop this? How can we help working memory? And one of the key things is to do this thing called rehearsal. So to find ways of helping pupils to keep rehearsing things as we would with a phone number. So if someone gives you a number, you tend to say it out loud, don't you? 234 1523, 234 1523. Often we do it out loud, which it is our instinctive way, isn't it, of helping us remember. That in itself is interesting, isn't it, that we do it out loud? But we can also do it in our heads. And actually, the psychology here is that when we do something, rehearse it silently in our head, it does activate the same parts of the brain as when we say something out loud. So in other words, reading silently, if you are able to say the words out loud in your head accurately, that it may not be quite as good as genuine listening or genuine speaking, but it's a good way towards it. So rehearsal. So let's have a look at rehearsal then. So ways that we can help pupils here, give them opportunities for rehearsal. Well, one is to use the famous technique wait time. So when you ask a question that you deliberately leave 5 seconds before you'll accept any answers, either with hands up or hands down. It's something that I think we sometimes resist as language teachers, because many of us like the idea of pace in the lesson, don't we? We want snappy responses, and therefore we want question, answer, drill, response, drill, response. But actually, that might work for some pupils, but it's probably too fast for many. And certainly I've observed lessons where that's the case. I can tell that it's going over the heads of some pupils and just too fast. So there may be a good balance here to be achieved as a teacher, sometimes achieving that sort of pace, sometimes building in wait time, and then using, say, mini whiteboards or hands up or cold calling. Think what's happening during wait time. Ideally, what's happening is that pupils are rehearsing quietly, and you'll know this yourself, as a pupil, perhaps when you put your hand up and you were waiting, self-consciously worried about giving your answer to the teacher, but what were you doing? You were rehearsing things. And by that repetition in your brain, you're building a stronger memory trace and giving it more chance to go into long-term memory. Mini whiteboards are one good way, of course, of ensuring that that rehearsal is taking place, so that the children don't just switch off. They have to show evidence that they've been rehearsing. Delayed dictation and delayed copying and delayed choral repetition. These are all handy and quite enjoyable activities for students, just in case you're not sure what these are. Delayed dictation is like a traditional dictation, but where you give a phrase, but then you wait for about 10 seconds before the students write down the answer. And of course, what's happening in that 10 seconds, they're engaging in maintenance rehearsal, and then they're writing down. They also, I think, like that little short-term memory challenge. Students tend to respond well to that. The same would be true of delayed copying, where you put some text on the board, let students look at it, maybe read it aloud, then hide it, and then students write it down later. One that seems to be used less, but which I think some teachers do use, and that's delayed choral repetition. So with our beginners, for example, instead of standard choral repetition, which is very useful, of course, why not try a different version where, say, you wait 5 seconds and then give a very clear sign, like a click of the finger or a tap, and then the students all respond at the same time. Again, I think it just adds a little bit of motivation here. By the way, these little tricks that you can employ as a language teacher, they're all what you might call marginal gains. Some of you will remember Dave Brailsford, who coach of the Team Sky cycling team in the Tour de France, and he always talks about marginal gains. If you can do lots of little things a little bit better, then that can help with progress. The classic running dictation is an example of where there is rehearsal going on. So the child who goes to the wall, fetches the text, has to keep it ticking over in their brain as they go back to the scribe who then writes it down. The activity which Gianfranco and I call disappearing text, and certainly one that I used to use a lot as a teacher, is where you've displayed a text on the board, and then on the next slide, you take away some words. And then on a third slide, you take away some more words, and so on. So I can certainly recall, to my amusement, say a year 9 or year 10 class, you get to the point where you're simply showing an empty slide. The pupils are looking at the white screen and they're remembering the text. And during that whole process of recalling the missing words, they've been rehearsing that language over and over and over. The classic sort of accumulation game, you know the one I mean, I went to the market and bought, and then you add successive items, a kilo of carrots and a bottle of milk, a kilo of carrots and a bottle of milk, and a pound of apples, whatever it might be. That is a good maintenance rehearsal game. And the classic Kim's game, the one where you show items on the screen and then you take away an item on the next slide. So a reminder here that when we activate language in working memory, even when we do it silently, it's the equivalent of actually hearing it, saying it, or reading it. The actual saying out loud does seem to have an advantage though, as does writing down. So there's been research on this to show that memory is enhanced when we write something down or when we say it out loud. And it seems to be, the theory is at least, that when we add these extra motor skills involved in speaking, it's called the production effect. And the production effect is that we tend to remember it better once we've produced it, and the same for writing. You may have heard as well that handwriting tends to be better than typing on a keyboard. There seems to be research evidence for that as well. So in other words, if you get kids to copy things down, you don't need to feel ashamed about that. There could well be some value in it. Okay, so let's move on and talk a little bit about phonological memory. And here I'm looking partly at vocabulary learning here, because when we talk about knowing words and knowing chunks, phrases, it's not just knowing what they mean, which tends to be what we focus on. We get kids to learn the meaning of words, don't we? But it's also about knowing what they sound like. The point here being that if we want students to recall words and chunks during listening comprehension, then if they've learnt those words, not just in their written form, but they've heard them pronounced accurately multiple times, and they've pronounced them accurately multiple times, then they're more likely to understand them when they appear in the stream of sound. So knowing words and chunks then is much more than simply knowing the meaning. And as language teachers, I think we need to keep that in mind. It's about knowing sound, as well as, for example, knowing the company that those words keep. So the common collocations, as they're called, those word combinations that frequently occur, so that when we're listening, we can hear those groups of words together and we can make meaning from them more easily. Quick definitions, by the way, from linguistics here, because these things aren't always understood by every teacher. When we talk about phonology here, we're talking about the sound system of a language. So we're talking about phonemes, those individual units of sound unique to each language. We're also talking about, by the way, intonation, the sort of prosodic features of the language that can be important as well. Phonotactics, which is often a new word to people, is really about the acceptable combinations of sounds that we hear in connected speech. So for example, I'm not a Hispanist, but I understand that in Spanish, you can't start a word with str, str, if you like, which is why Spanish speakers might tend to, when they're using English, say instead of strong, they might say strong, because they're not used to strong. So that's a rule of phonotactics. What are the acceptable combinations of phonemes? And then the thing that's all the rage at the moment, particularly in England, although interestingly, not very much in some other jurisdictions. Americans don't talk about this very much, but this is very much an English thing at the moment, and it's phonics, sound spelling relationships. So to be clear, phonics is not phonology. It involves phonology, it involves sound, it involves pronunciation, but crucially, it's about the sound spelling relationships. And this is a big thing at the moment in state-maintained schools and academies, where Ofsted are coming along and expecting the curriculum to pay attention to phonics and a sequenced approach to phonics. But in terms of phonological memory, if we want to develop phonological skill and phonics skill, then a big plug for reading aloud, following transcripts, seeing the written word as we hear it. Brief reflection on this: when I began training, and depending on your experience, you might have been taught actually it's a bad thing to show the language, particularly in the early stages, because it might lead to poor pronunciation. And actually, I read a research paper the other day that suggested there's something in this still. But I think the key here is just to make sure that when you use transcripts and when you do reading aloud, it's just done really well and scaffolded in such a way that students do pronounce well and then develop their skill at reading aloud. I think one of the reasons why phonics has come to the fore, I think there are political reasons for this, but also research in modern languages that shows that, for example, after say 3 years of learning, there are many students who, when they see a French sentence, pronounce it incredibly badly. They can't cope at all. And that may be due to a lack of attention. It may be simply to do with poor teaching, to be honest, but it is probably a lack of attention to reading aloud and accurate pronunciation. So that's, I suppose, me urging all language teachers to just be really thorough about things like choral repetition and reading aloud from the board, that sort of thing, and to do it really well. And not only does it lead to good memory for pronunciation, but it also helps with listening comprehension for the reasons I gave earlier. So here's a few practical activities. These are taken from the book that was mentioned earlier on by John, actually, Breaking the Sound Barrier. And these tasks, a small selection of the many in that book about how we can help build phonological memory. I'll just describe each one of these to you very briefly. You may have used one or two, or you can add these to your toolbox of classroom activities. Track the sound, the simple one where you read out a text, perhaps featuring a sound, a difficult phoneme that you want to focus on, or a difficult sound letter combination if you want to focus on phonics. And as you read, students track, if you like, as many instances of that sound as they can. They could simply put their hand up whenever they hear that sound, or whenever they see in a text that combination of letters and sound. It can be done in song form or with nursery rhymes, and it just makes, if you like, work on phonology and phonics a bit more interactive and a bit more fun. It takes it beyond the simply reading from the slide, because phonics can be very dull if you simply show words and highlight, let's say in red, where you've got a different sound spelling correspondence. Okay, I'm not saying that's not useful, but it is essentially a not very exciting activity. Whereas if you can get something a bit more interactive with pupils that's using phonics, and often in the communicative context, then it's going to be more motivational and probably more effective as well. Faulty echo is the name given to this activity. I'm just going to give your ears a rest for a second. Just have a look at those instructions. Apologies for the typo in point 3. Make sure that the wrong pronunciation reproduces mistakes commonly made. So you just say 2 words, or it could even be chunks, phrases, and the second time you might make a mistake. A variation of this, which I used to like playing with classes, and I've done this in workshops with teachers, and they enjoy this very much actually. And just very briefly, it's something like this. So you say two words, and the class simply has to identify whether the two words are the same or different. So if I were live in a workshop with you, I might say something like, in French, tout, tout. And you'd have to say, were they the same or were they different? They were the same. Then I might say, tout, tout. Same or different? They were the same. Hopefully you're listening carefully when I do that. And in a classroom, when you do that sort of activity, it really does make students concentrate, because they're desperate to spot whether something is different. And you can actually play around with the class when you do this and do the same pair of words identically several times before eventually you let them off the hook by saying, tout, tu. And in doing this, you've slightly gamified focus on phonology here, the difficult, awkward contrast between the U and U sound, which we know is important for German and for French. So those sorts of little fun activities are good for developing phonological memory for sounds. And so when we look at what are called minimal pairs, a minimal pair, in case you don't know, this is where we have two words and it's just one change of phoneme which changes the meaning of the word. So I've given you some examples from French, German, and Spanish. So in French, top left, blanc, blond. So here we're getting pupils to hear that difference between the two nasal vowels, and just sort of building up, both by explicit attention to it, by explaining to them the difference in the sound, but more importantly, by simple repetition, hence the implicit route. It's by using it, repeating it multiple times, that it will stick. That's how we help build our memory for sounds. So you can play around with those, and you can do them either where they just hear the difference, or of course you can write them down or show them on the screen and let them say them out loud. Here's one that would work in French in particular, about spotting the correct transcription. So you give your class a gapped version of a sentence with 3 near homophones, and then you read the sentence at a reasonable speed, and students choose the right option. So in French, the teacher would say, j'y vais avec lui, I go with him, or I go there with him. Students see on the board, j'y vais avec, but with a gap, and you give them 3 options, and the options are lui, lui, l'huile, and they have to choose which one it is. So here we're working at the level of phonology, but also at the level of phonics quite clearly, because here we're seeing in French that the UI gives you a UI sound and the OUI gives you an OUI sound. And that's a difficult one, isn't it? As you will know, French teachers, for students to get. Again, it just adds an element of greater interest than simple repetition. And the next one, which we call in the book mind reading. I'll just let you read that first. And it's simply a guessing game. And you know very well, don't you, with your year 7s, for example, your beginners or primary beginners, that they just love a guessing game, don't they? Even if it's holding a whiteboard and guessing what's on the whiteboard. Or rather a flashcard, I should say. So again, simple guessing games, focus on sounds and developing phonological memory. And you know, if you do this stuff really well in year 7, year 8, you've then got them, haven't you, for the next 5 years. The difficulty can come when you get a class and you inherit a class, which does happen. Let's say you get them in year 10 and they haven't done that basic work lower down. They can't read aloud. They're pronouncing badly. It's pretty difficult to pull it back at that point. So I think, you know, year 7 is absolutely crucial for getting all this stuff in place. And it is a reminder that, you know, pronunciation is important. It's not the be all and the end all. I mean, we know that we can communicate with weak pronunciation and still be understood, but the risk is that if we sacrifice pronunciation, for the reasons I've been outlining, we're also risking harming their ability to understand the language as well. So I've mentioned how I think reading aloud is good for building memory, and I just want to describe one activity to you here. And it's a game which in the Breaking the Sound Barrier book we called Sentence Chaos. Very easy one, this, but quite a nice one. And I think you'll see, if you haven't played it before, you simply show on the board, let's say 10 sentences. You could make it 12, maybe with some classes even more. And then you get the students in groups of 3, where one is a sort of referee. Now, the referee person reads out the sentences on the board, but in a different order. It's therefore useful to number these, by the way, because then the referee can just jot down a number as they decide which order they're going to read them. So the referee reads them out in a different order, and then each of the other 2 students, each player, has to repeat the sentences in the same order that the referee did. Now, it would be, I think someone needs muting there, by the way. It needs, unless someone had an absolutely brilliant photographic memory, they're never going to get all 10 sentences right on the first attempt. So each of the players gets a go, and then they get 5 attempts. After each attempt, the original referee player reads them again, and they keep going 5 attempts, and the player who can get the longest correct sequence wins. So what we've got here is language that pupils can understand, comprehensible input. We've got repetition for memory. We've got a focus on phonics through the reading aloud, and a little bit of fun and the competitive element that we know that pupils like. It's also very low preparation, this one, as you can see. And the sentences that you would display would be ones using familiar language that they've used before. So here's an example from French, 10 simple sentences where the focus here happens to be on using the perfect tense with être verbs, je suis allé, je suis entré. So there is a sort of grammatical focus on this. We want pupils to hear over and over again, je suis allé, je suis allé, je suis entré, so that by implicit learning, they will then be able to trot that out in spontaneous speech, not having to analyze the grammar. It's just there as a chunk. Je suis allé, and they can grab it from the long memory store. Now, moving on to the 5th part of 6 here, and this is the idea of chunking. Now, I hope you can see on your screen those 2 sets of symbols, one in blue, one in green. Just have a look at them. You'll see that one of them is far easier to learn than the other, and for obvious reasons, but this is where chunking comes into play. So in the first list, we have a whole bunch of separate numbers or letters. And we know, going back to the 1950s, the work by Miller, that when we come to numbers, we can probably, most of us remember about 7 plus or minus 2. That's why, incidentally, in America, when the Bell Corporation was designing phone numbers, they wanted phone numbers to be no longer than 7 because they thought that was a number that people could remember. But even then, we tend to break down phone numbers into chunks, don't we? We think of 3 numbers together and then say 5. In French, they do it in pairs, don't they? They say 23, 47, and it helps you remember. In the second row, what's helped us there is our prior knowledge of things like BBC, ITV, Sky, and also the sequence 1, 2, 3, 4. So effectively, all we've got to learn there is 5 chunks, if you like. Whereas in the first one above, we've got loads of digits to remember. Now, there's been loads of research on chunking and how much we can hold in working memory. You'll see different figures, but generally it's thought that when it comes to digits, that sort of 7 plus or minus 2 is not bad. But when it comes to ideas or language, then we're probably looking at something between 3 to at most 5. It will vary between individuals. There are some people who have a better working memory capacity than others, but actually the range is not huge. And it develops very quickly during childhood and is very strong in late teens and 20s, and then gradually our working memory slightly declines with age thereafter. But the obvious point to make here is that if we want students to handle language in class, is it more efficient to work at the level of individual words or at the level of chunks? In other words, if I wanted a child to hold in working memory 3 to 5 units, is it better just to have separate words, or is it better to have chunked language? In other words, 3 or 5 short sentences or phrases. And in terms of communicative power, then chunks would appear to be more effective. And actually, if I think anecdotally, when I was teaching my, let's say, year 10, year 11 classes of say relatively middling aptitude, the ones who at GCSE would be in sort of new money, getting, let's say, 4s and 5s, I found with them I was probably wasting my time teaching grammatical rules and even getting them to learn lists of words. What I really wanted them to do was to keep rehearsing the same useful chunks that they could then use in an oral exam. So they would hear things like, I went to the cinema, loads and loads of times as a chunk, and they could grab that chunk and use it in extremis. Now I've got some language I can use to communicate with. Whereas if they had just words to learn from lists, we know this to be the case, that then going from that to spontaneous speech in sentences is a major, major leap. And I'm going to come to that when I talk about TAP in a second. So ways that we can work at chunk level, very briefly, when we're doing quizzing, let's say vocab recall at the beginning of a lesson, why not use chunks rather than words? Sentence builder tables, knowledge underlines of booklets, question answer drills where you're using full sentences, classic audio lingual drills. I'll show you an example in a second. All of these are using connected language, chunked language, and therefore it's more likely that when students have to reproduce language, they can use chunked language. And of course, the advantage of chunks as well is, going back to something I said earlier, it develops our depth of vocabulary knowledge because we're using words in context. So we're focusing not just on the meaning of words or even just on the sound, but on how words work with other words. So the traditional model that we're kind of used to hearing about, which is kind of we learn words and we glue them together with grammar, doesn't seem to work very well. And we know this from centuries of experience, that with many pupils, teaching grammar rules and learning vocabulary is not an efficient way to acquire language, and it doesn't align with research. So how useful is it to know about the language? Well, it probably has some use, and I doubt if many of us would disagree about that, but it's not the most important thing. So rather than a words and grammar view of things, how about a sort of chunk and chain view of things? In other words, working always at chunk level, and then when students have to write and when they speak, they can chain together and slot in these chunks that they've learned. And remember, these aren't just set phrases, these are common combinations of words. Sometimes chunking is, I think, mischaracterized as just being learning formulaic phrasebook sort of phrases. It isn't that, it's common collocations. It is things like, I went to the cinema, and so on. And these aren't formulaic phrases, these are common chunks. Is there a limit to chunking? Well, Scott Thornbury famously said, there's a risk of all chunks and no pineapple. So in other words, if you do no grammar at all, it's possible that you're going to limit the creative possibility of students. And then it's down to your class. How much grammar can they handle? And only you know that. And it's probably amongst the higher aptitude pupils where we're going to see more advantages for some grammar as well. So there's a reminder of what a typical sentence builder looks like. Usually the best ones are pretty simple, but they do feature chunked language, and so we can slot in items in each column. You can have fun with these, by the way. You could include bizarre combinations, absurd combinations, silly sentences, That appeals a lot to your average year 8, for example. You like the absurd. You can include cultural knowledge in these as well. I sometimes do separate presentations actually on how you can exploit these in many different ways, but I haven't got time for that today, unfortunately. I mentioned audiolingual drills, so these have gone out of fashion, but I certainly like these as starters for building memory of chunks. So the sort of thing where you say to a class, today I play football, or today I'm playing football, and they simply come back and say, yesterday I played tennis. So they're having to manipulate the verb and having to retrieve from memory some different vocabulary. So these are very easy starters, transformation drills. Today I'm traveling by train. Answer, yesterday I traveled by bus, and so on and so on. So here we're acquiring grammar, we're using chunk language, and we're doing it actually pretty much through implicit learning, probably with some working memory going on here, because pupils will be thinking, how do I change the verb here? How do I make it past? So we're combining the explicit with the implicit. See what I mean there? So I think that's a rather good activity. The criticism made, by the way, of this sort of drill is that it's rather mechanical. It's not very communicative, and it is a valid criticism, but I would say that as part of a mix, given what it achieves, it's comprehensible, it's slightly interactive, it is manipulating language. I can see a lot of pluses. It's also very clear to students what they've got to do. Here's a little activity for you, which I call translate, transcribe. So in this one, students see a text in English. You can see this is pretty much a beginner, low intermediate sort of text. And you dictate it in the target language. And then the students write the translation as they listen. So it's a combination of transcription and translation. You can do that at various levels. Very good with song lyrics. If you get the right song, you can do translate, transcribe with songs. It's a nice alternative to gap fill. Okay, I just skipped a slide there. I'm just going to go back there. Previous. So here we have, if you wanted to make it easier for a weaker class, you can give them a gapped version to work on. Of course, gap fills are great for building memory, phonological memory, phonics skill, and so on. Finally, keeping an eye on the time, TAP. Now, this is a really interesting finding from memory research. And it's the idea that when we encode information at the beginning, we don't just encode the information itself, but we encode the context of the information. So, for example, if you were teaching in German, my leg hurts, and you want them to memorize the sentence, mein Bein tut mir weh, my leg hurts. Now, if you were to then demonstrate that by hobbling around the classroom in a comic fashion to show that your leg hurts, when students recall that phrase, they're not just recalling the phrase, they're recalling the context. They remember what happened at the time. And this happens all the time with learning. The context, the story, let's say, that you set the language in, the visual aid you used, whatever it might be, that's encoded alongside the actual information. So if you then recreate the same cues at the retrieval stage, you retrieve language more easily. And this has been researched a lot. And what it means for us, for example, is when we're testing pupils, if we test the pupils in the same way that we taught them, then they're going to have more success. And I used to use a course called Tricolore for French. You might be familiar with it. And actually that book was quite good in this regard. In other words, the end of unit tests tended to resemble the activities you've done already. So the test really felt like an extension of normal work. Technically, this is called cue-dependent remembering. In other words, if you set the same cue when you test retrieval, then pupils will do better. Now, you might decide that with some students, you need to push them a bit further. You need to create a little bit of extra difficulty. So you might want to slightly change the context And so for a higher aptitude class, you might try them with that. Say, okay, so instead of just doing exactly the same task we did during the lesson, let's tweak it a little bit. But if you tweak it too much, then chances are there'll be problems. So if I give you an extreme example, let's say that during a sequence of lessons, you've never used translation, but then in the test, you suddenly give them some sentences to translate to test that same language. Many students would struggle. Not that they don't necessarily know the language, but they only know the language in the context that they learnt it. For example, the child who can recite the alphabet to a song, but if you ask them to spell a word, they can't do it. The child who can count to 20, but if you ask them to do a simple sum, they can't do it. So this is TAP, transfer appropriate processing, and I think it's a handy way for me to finish off because my hour is virtually up, I think. Implications of that then, watch out for cue dependent remembering. Think of backward design when you design your tests or use your tests. Are they recreating the same sort of activity you did in class? But do you need to get a little bit more challenge in there? What Robert Bjork calls desirable difficulty. And remember the power of stories for memory. In other words, your personal experiences, anecdotes, moments in the class, anything that fires the imagination might help with reactivating memory later. So let me, in a shameless plug, commend these 3 books to you. Our general manual for language teachers, the Language Teacher Toolkit, Breaking the Sound Barrier, focus more on listening, and Memory, what every language teacher should know. And finally, my own books and materials, the French Teacher website, which I keep regularly up to date, my book 50 lesson plans for French teachers, which is kind of a breakdown of individual steps of lesson planning, and Becoming an Outstanding Languages Teacher. And there's actually a 2nd edition of that coming out on August the 3rd from Routledge. It needed some updating, particularly on the technical digital tools and that sort of thing. So that's coming out in August, and I would recommend it, particularly, I think, for teachers in training and young teachers. So I'd like to stop there. Thank you very much. I hope that's given you some food for thought, as well as some practical ideas, and I'll hand back to John. Thank you.
Steve, thank you